Scream and Shout with Rene Sandler is a weekly radio show with an edge.
Object to this witness being called at this time. And as the court is aware, the defense is entitled to advance notice of any witness who will testify.
That is a lucid, intelligent, well-thought-out objection. Overruled.
Rene Sandler is a criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor who has been recognized as one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the country. Each week, Scream and Shout with Rene Sandler will feature a summary of the week's headlines, plus the hottest interviews, leading attorneys, entertainers, advocates, crime victims, policymakers, and more. Now, here's your host of Scream and Shout, Rene Sandler.
Hello, everybody, on this wonderful Thursday afternoon. How is everyone doing? Well, if you live on the East Coast, you're probably still freezing, and it's March. We have had more snow in my home state of Maryland than I can remember in recent years. This is Rene Sandler on the Scream and Shout show right here on Blog Talk Radio. We'd love to hear from you, 347-826-7072, or follow us on Twitter at Sandler Law LLC. We have a couple of great guests today. Paul Armentano, the Deputy Director of NORML and the NORML Foundation. That means marijuana. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And later in the show, Jim Mendrinos, a comedian. Saying he's a comedian is an understatement. He's a writer, he's a stand-up comedian, and he has a new show coming out, and we'll talk to him in a little while. Talking about news, we hear so much out there, and a lot of it is just not good. The state of the world, the acts of violence, the Pistorius trial that's out there, grisly facts come out today. But I wanted to start at the top of the show with something out of my area in Maryland. A young man, a 12-year-old boy, his name is Colin McCarthy, who saved a man's life. This is what happened. A tractor trailer overturned. Young man, Colin McCarthy, was in the vehicle with his mom, Marcy. They see this vehicle, and Colin urges his mom to stop the vehicle. And it's icy, and it's snowy, and it's cold, and his mom stops the vehicle. And that young man, 12 years old, gets out of his mom's vehicle and races toward this overturned tractor trailer. It was on an intersection of 81 South and 70 East, which are big thoroughfares here in Maryland, out near Frederick, Maryland. And this young man called 911. We have a guest that's getting ready to join us, but I wanted to, again, call out Colin McCarthy, a 12-year-old young man who saved the life of a trucker who was overturned and pinned in his vehicle, and but for the good work, the emergency action of Colin and his mom, truck driver Denny is on the road to recovery and doing well. So a shout-out for Colin McCarthy, 12 years old, in Maryland. You deserve an award, young man, for acting quickly and saving a young man's life. We have our first guest, Paul Armentano. In the news, we hear about marijuana. We hear about the legalization of marijuana. We hear about medical marijuana. And here to discuss all of that is Paul Armentano. Paul's the Deputy Director of NORML and the NORML Foundation, and he's reviewed and commented on thousands and thousands of academic studies and white papers that are all pertinent to cannabis use and its impact on behavior. Yeah, Paul's testified on many, many, many occasions before state lawmakers and federal agencies. He's also a court-certified expert, and he's testified to the behavioral effects and the pharmacokinetics of cannabis and cannabinoids. Paul, are you there?
I am. Thank you for having me today.
I'm so happy to have you, Paul. As a former prosecutor and a defense attorney, I can't tell you about the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of cases that I've had involving marijuana, and I'd like for you to shed some light on various issues related to marijuana. And so I thank you for being here.
Well, I'd be happy to address any of the questions you have. Certainly, we are at a unique time in our point's history, and there is a lot to talk about.
Well, right out of the gate, let's talk about the legalization of marijuana and some trends that you're seeing legislatively. I mean, tell our listeners what you're seeing in terms of this possibility really across the country.
Well, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, in November of 2012, the majority of voters in 2 states, in Colorado and in Washington, for the first time in modern history, went to the ballot box and a majority pressed the button or pulled the lever to abolish the criminal prohibition of marijuana in those 2 states and replace it with a regulated system governing the commercial production and the retail sale and the adult use of cannabis. And when we look to the national polling on this issue, whether we're looking at Gallup, whether we're looking at CNN, whichever poll we want to look at, we see that now this is the majority position of Americans in 2014. The status quo, the idea of criminalizing marijuana and criminalizing and stigmatizing and prosecuting the users of marijuana, is a fringe position today. It is the minority position. The majority position is to regulate marijuana accordingly so that adults no longer face prosecution, potential incarceration, the criminal record, and the stigma that associates such a prosecution over their use of a plant that is objectively safer than alcohol.
Yeah, you raise a very interesting question and issues. And let me tell you something that I hear on an almost daily basis in front of judges. Judges say to my clients and to those that come before them that marijuana is a gateway drug to other substances. What is your response to that?
Again, if we're going to look at the science, and the science really ought to be the basis for our public policy. Unfortunately, in the case of marijuana, it is not now, nor really has it ever been. But when we look to the science, we see that there is no scientific justification for the notion that somebody who is exposed to marijuana will somehow irrevocably alter their brain's chemistry to the point where they have a craving for other controlled substances that impact the body and affect the brain and manifest themselves in ways that are entirely contrary to the way marijuana interacts with the human body. There's simply nothing to support that. Now, there is a notion that some people who subsequently go on to use certain controlled substances like cocaine or heroin may have previously used marijuana at some point in their previous history. But that's simply a reflection of the fact that marijuana use is a highly popularized activity in our society, so it is not surprising that a portion of the public who engages in a high-risk minority activity, like the use of cocaine or heroin, at some previous point also engage in very popular, relatively low-risk activity, like the use of marijuana. But it's certainly not a justification to criminalize the users of marijuana in any more way than we would arrest and prosecute adult responsible users of alcohol, because a small percentage of those individuals who use alcohol at some point may go on to drive under the influence of alcohol. We prosecute that behavior. We don't prosecute the responsible behavior.
Have you, Paul, followed the legalization and the process in Colorado in such a way that you're able to give any opinions of the success or failures, or give any opinions about, or is it too early to talk about what's going on in Colorado?
I don't think it's too early at all. In fact, I was involved in the Amendment 64 ballot initiative campaign in Colorado. I was involved in the drafting of the language of that ballot initiative, and certainly have paid very close attention to the implementation of that law and those regulations since the measure has been passed. And
what can you tell our listeners about patterns that you've seen? I mean, who is there a certain age group of purchasers? I mean, what have you seen? What's worked in Colorado?
Well, keep in mind, an adult's ability to legally possess up to an ounce of marijuana and grow up to 6 marijuana plants in the privacy of their home, that took effect immediately after the passage of the ballot initiative. So those regulations have been in place now for well over a year. The licensed production and retail sale of marijuana began on January 1st of this year. And what we have seen so far is that the tax revenue that is coming into the state of Colorado due to the sale of marijuana in these licensed retail outlets far exceeds the expectations or the estimates that the state had initially. That's actually quite surprising, given that there is a lower number of licensed retailers and producers operating now than was expected, yet we're seeing a increase in the tax revenue that is coming into that state. The reality is that while you and I are speaking to one another, there are literally thousands of transactions taking place all around this country involving individuals obtaining cannabis. But only in Colorado are those transactions taking place legally in a regulated market where the product is of standardized quality, where the sale is taxed, and where the individuals who are engaging in these purchases are dealing with licensed businesses and not the criminal element. And that, in my opinion, is a positive development.
No, it's an excellent point. This is Rene Sandler, and this is Scream and Shout, only here on Blog Talk Radio. We are speaking with Paul Armentano, Deputy Director of NORML and the NORML Foundation. Paul, there's been some movement in D.C. with the D.C. Council votes to ease marijuana laws. What can you tell our listeners about D.C. and where we are today?
This is actually a very important development. So what happened this week was the members of the D.C. City Council signed off on legislation to decriminalize the possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana and also to decriminalize paraphernalia that would be associated with the consumption or use of marijuana. Now, when we talk about the term decriminalization, what we are referring to is a policy where the individual user of marijuana is no longer subject to criminal arrest, criminal prosecution, and possible incarceration, but the marijuana itself remains contraband, and the individual, if he runs afoul of law enforcement, will pay a fine for possessing that marijuana, and the marijuana will be seized. Now, there's about 16 states that have decriminalization policies on the book. The Washington, D.C. is now poised to join them because under the legislation that was just approved by the council, the possession of an ounce of marijuana would be punishable by a $25 civil fine, rather than under present D.C. law, possession of any amount of marijuana is a criminal misdemeanor punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a criminal record. This is actually really significant for the district because the ACLU did a report late last year that found that Washington, D.C., had a per capita arrest rate for marijuana possession that was among the very highest in the nation. So this was clearly a region of the country where this will be a very welcome change to reduce marijuana possession penalties from a criminal offense to a civil violation. It would certainly, hopefully, be the start of similar legislation and similar efforts moving forward around the district, like in Maryland and like in Virginia. Maryland, according to that same ACLU report, Maryland has the 5th highest marijuana arrest rate per capita in the nation, and Virginia also has one of the highest per capita arrest rates for marijuana possession in the nation. And in both those states, possession of an ounce of marijuana is punishable by up to 1 year in jail in addition to a criminal record.
Well, I can tell you, Paul, defending marijuana cases for almost 16 years and having had to prosecute teeny tiny amounts of marijuana, which had carried a year in jail at that time. You know, Maryland has changed the law to decrease by citation now, not arrest, the amount to 10 grams or less. And I think Maryland needs to figure out what it wants to do because the numbers are just astounding. This is Rene Sandler on Scream and Shout here on Blog Talk Radio. We're thrilled to have Paul Armentano here, for the Deputy Director of NORML and the NORML Foundation. Paul, we have a caller, Mike from New York, who has a question on this issue. Are you happy to take questions on this? I'm sure.
Yes, I am.
Mike?
Hey, how are you? First and foremost, Rene, I love your show. I'm so glad that you're on, so thank you for that. And is it Paul?
Yes.
Paul, I'm from New York, and I was just curious to know, when do you think New York will ever legalize marijuana, either for medical and or not spiritual, but and or recreational? Pardon me.
New York is a very complex state when it comes to trying to enact legislative reform. And
actually, when it comes to anything, right?
Right. When it comes to anything, and particularly this issue, New York has been a high-priority state for marijuana law reformers for quite some time. And as I'm sure you're probably aware, we've had medical marijuana legislation introduced in the Assembly and actually passed through the Assembly several years in a row now, yet those bills have all died in the Senate because leadership in the Senate has been really reluctant to take up this issue. There have been inklings from Senate leadership this year that they are now, in fact, more open to discussing this issue. There's also, of course, been rumblings from the governor to try and reinstate a dormant New York state law that establishes therapeutic research programs for investigational use new drugs and trying to gain marijuana access that way. The reality is I do think there is going to be some limited medical marijuana law coming to New York within the next couple of years. But in my mind, the reform that New York really needs is they need to equalize the penalties for the private possession of marijuana with marijuana possession in public view. As you're probably aware, New York State actually decriminalized the private possession of marijuana in the late 1970s, yet possession of marijuana in public view remains an arrestable offense classified as a criminal misdemeanor. And what we see is in New York City, for instance, where there's annually somewhere between 30,000 to 45,000 marijuana possession arrests, we see that law enforcement are using the public view loophole to essentially do an end run around the state's decriminalization law.
Can I interrupt and ask you a follow-up question real quick?
Sure.
In these states where they do medical marijuana, I mean, is it only like glaucoma? I mean, what kind of people get medical marijuana?
Well, 20 states now allow for the physicians to recommend marijuana in particular circumstances. Those circumstances vary from state to state. There are some states like California where it is entirely up to a doctor's discretion. There are other states like Maine and Rhode Island where the state puts forward a qualifying list of conditions, and a physician can only recommend marijuana for a patient suffering from one of those particular conditions.
Interesting. Great, thank you so much, and
thanks, Mike.
Rene, keep up the great work.
Well, thanks for calling. Paul, this is Rene Sandler and the Scream and Shout Show on Blog Talk Radio. We are talking to Paul Armentano from NORML. Paul, can you try and dispel some myths about marijuana for our listeners? Give me the top 10 if you have them.
Oh boy, well, there's a lot more than 10, but
sure.
I'll try to address a couple. So, when it seems like when individuals are concerned about this idea of liberalizing the laws for marijuana, we hear time and time again that opponents say, we don't want to introduce a new substance into society. We already have tobacco and alcohol and prescription drugs. Why do we want to introduce another substance that can potentially be abused? And my response to that is that by regulating cannabis for adults, we're not introducing a new substance. We are recognizing the reality that despite 70-plus years of criminal federal prohibition, that marijuana is a popularized substance, that it poses relatively few risks compared to those associated with the use of alcohol, tobacco, and prescription drugs, and that we are not introducing a new substance. This substance is already here, and it's time for our public policies to reflect that reality. The criminalization of marijuana is a disproportionate public policy response to what is, at worst, a public health concern, but not a criminal justice concern.
Well, Paul, this has been a fascinating conversation. I know our listeners have learned a great deal. I'm in it every day, and I see what judges are saying about marijuana. Most of it, I think they need to talk to you and learn the truth about it if you want to know the truth. I hope you come back as things change and as legislation changes across the country. Paul Armentano, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you today for having me, and if folks want to learn more about NORML and more about marijuana, they can go to our website, www.norml.org, and I'd also encourage them to check out my book, Marijuana is Safer, So Why Are We Driving People to Drink?
I will encourage my listeners to do that, and I thank you again, and we'll talk to you again soon. Paul Armentano, Deputy Director of NORML and the NORML Foundation. This is Rene Sandler, and this is Scream and Shout, only here on Blog Talk Radio. Give us a call, 347-826-7072. Follow us on Twitter at Sandler Law LLC. We're glad to be here on these Thursdays at 4 talking to you. We have great guests, and our next guest, Jim Mendrinos, is ready to talk to us. Jim is a seasoned professional stand-up comedian. He began comedy at the age of 19. The audience has seen Jim grow up right before their eyes, appreciating his unique outlook on life every step of the way. He has a new show coming out. He is respected in the industry so much so that he was asked to author The Complete Idiot's Guide to Comedy Writing. His comedy has been featured on stand-up stages around the world. He's been on everything and everywhere, including Fox, HBO, and BBC. Jim, are you there?
I am here. I actually sound like I have a career.
You have an incredible career, and we're thrilled that you're joining us. First of all, tell us about your new show.
Living in Exile is it's a hybrid. Most web shows that are out are of the 3-minute variety. This is the first real piece of independent television ever. Episodes are 23 minutes in length. You can get season 1 is still online over on YouTube, and season 2 is coming out, and it'll be on Stay Tuned TV and YouTube as well. So it's really fun and really interesting.
Well, it sounds that I'm encourage my listeners to check you out. Do you have a website, Jim, just so our listeners know where to find you?
Yes, very modestly entitled worldsbestcomedian.com.
I love it. I love it.
Yep.
I understand you have some opinions about Lindsay Lohan's new reality show coming out. Can you share those opinions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Now, I know this is the web, so I'm still going to try and keep it clean, but why the hell is anybody still watching Lindsay Lohan? We don't even want to watch her act anymore. Why do we want to watch her be herself? I can think of nothing more boring than watching somebody just bitch and moan for hours on end, which is what this series sounds like. It's reality programs come in a lot of different varieties, but there's the train wreck variety where we want to see people just kind of self-destruct, and I think that's what the public's hoping for with Lindsay Lohan. Like, is this the episode where she just finally loses everything?
Have you happened to catch any of the sort of trailers or promos? I mean, it just looks like as you said, a train wreck. I mean, her mother, father, crazy.
Yeah. I got to be honest, I know substance abuse is nothing to make light of, but if I had those parents, I'd be getting high myself. That is just not a good home environment.
Well, following our last guest, who was the deputy director of NORML, we just talked about marijuana for 20 minutes. So I think our listeners have an understanding now of an appreciation for that comment. They probably agree with you.
Yeah, well, you know, Michael Owen, my dad. I don't think marijuana would be good enough. I think I'd be on the road looking for Molly, looking for heroin. That is just an awful, awful human being that you have to say, this is my dad.
We are talking to Jim Mendrinos here on Scream and Shout, only here on Blog Talk Radio. What did you think of the Academy Awards?
You know what? I actually thought they were awesome. If I was there, I would have wanted some pizza. You know, I think Ellen did a fun job hosting. They were too long as usual. It's fun. What's really fun is like following the post-award kind of, you know, drama. Like, Leo's upset that he didn't win. I think they're all upset when they don't win. I don't think it's just Leo.
I think you're right.
Or the
what do you think? The pizza guy was a setup, or was that real?
It was probably a setup, you know. But again, you know, there's a certain point where they're like, you know, it's a show, right? You know, people are like, I think it's real. It's really, you know, it's a TV show, right? You know, they're trying to entertain us. You know that they're going to do goofy stuff to entertain us. Why are you, you know, taking an affront to anything? People kind of forget that, you know, this whole thing about, well, you know, we got to treat, you know, this show with a lot more reverence than other shows. No, you don't. You're still basically entertaining the masses, and it's still, you know, a pretty little puppet show. And try not to forget that. Have you been following any of the post-controversy with John Ridley, 12 Years a Slave, and Steve McQueen, the director?
A little bit. Tell our listeners what you've been following.
Well, apparently, Steve McQueen, the director, did not thank John Ridley, the writer, when he got his award, and John Ridley, the writer, did not thank Steve McQueen, the director, when he got his award. And as two very prominent African Americans, it's caused a rift in the community. Like, how can they, you know, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing that to each other. We've got to stand together. We've got to, you know, put a united front together. And I understand that you want to, you know, promote positive imagery for African Americans. But what people forget is sometimes you just plain don't like somebody. You know,
and you think that was what it was about?
I really don't think John was, you know, not thanking Steve because Steve was the wrong kind of African American, or Steve not thanking John because John's the wrong kind of African American. I think, you know, every once in a while it happens in humanity. You just look at somebody and you go, I hate you. I hate everything about you. And that's probably the situation. I don't think it's racially motivated. I think it's personal hate. And we can't be looking for, you know, a race reaction when at times it's just pretty much, I don't like your face.
Well, that is an interesting perspective. Jim, tell my listeners one more time where to find you on your website.
WorldsBestComic.com, and look for Living in Exile Season 2, which is going to be launching in May of this year.
Jim Mendrinos, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it, and hope to have you back again.
Well, thank you. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, Jim. This is Rene Sandler and Scream and Shout. We're only here on Blog Talk Radio. It's been my pleasure to be here on Thursdays from 4 to 4:30 talking to you, bringing great guests, great issues, and just having a good time.
Follow us on Twitter at Sandler Law LLC and log on to SandlerLawLLC.com.